Next, I would like to discuss what is Indigenous Economic Design. The Indigenomics Institute posits three core concepts. The first is the Indigenous economy cannot exist solely within government programs and services. Secondly, we need to collectively move beyond the measurement of this Indigenous socioeconomic gap. Thirdly, economic reconciliation must happen within the fiscal equation of this country. I draw your attention to my work on the current Liberal government's previous mandate, where I sat as a senior advisor to Minister Murnau on the Canadian Economic Growth Council. In my work of bringing visibility to the importance of Indigenous economic inclusion, I came across a figure that demonstrated, while dated, a significant demonstration of the Indigenous spend in economy and our relationship to understanding economic strength of Indigenous peoples overall. The 2016 visual demonstration of the national Indigenous spend identified 92% of fiscal activities that supported social activities, education, health, infrastructure, negotiation, implementation, while the budget saw 6% focused on the promotion of reconciliation, which left 2% for economic development. This is a classic example of the social cart pulling the economic horse. This is a demonstration of the fiscal requirements of the need to understand what are the tools and leverage for the support, design, growth of the Indigenous economy itself. So while this demonstration of a financial number may have shifted within the 2020 budget context, what is important to be able to demonstrate is that the focused attention of the Indigenous economy must move beyond a percentage of a budget and the facilitation of programs and services and the measurement of socioeconomic growth to actually generate Indigenous economic activity, establish Indigenous local economic impact and strength, and to be able to demonstrate this in correlation to Canada's economy. The Indigenomics Institute, in December 2017, at a special Chiefs Assembly at the AFN, put forward a $100 billion Indigenous economic challenge. There are so many times that I am asked, why $100 billion? If we look to the size of the Indigenous population and correlate that to the size of Canada's GDP, what can be established is while Indigenous peoples make up just under 5% of Canada's population, it follows then that with Indigenous economic design and support, Indigenous peoples can generate up to close to 5% of Canada's GDP. What is important in that is that the Institute is driving a concept that Indigenous peoples can no longer be viewed solely on the cost side of the equation of this country. Instead, we need to be able to be viewed as generative economies that are supporting and impacting smaller regional and national economy. To understand the difference between only solely seeing Indigenous peoples on the cost side of the equation versus seeing as generative economic contributors, what follows is to support the Indigenous economy with the tools and resources required for the growth of Indigenous economic design and strength. While a 2016 TV Economic Special Report gave an initial value of the size of the Indigenous economy in 2016 to be estimated at $32 billion. I draw your attention to a National Indigenous Economic Development report on closing the socioeconomic gap that was identified, that also set out that if the Indigenous workforce was actualized, this would add $27.7 billion annually to Canada's GDP. Where is the strategic pathway forward? To be able to bring Indigenous nations onto the contribution of Canada's national and regional GDPs requires new efforts of Indigenous economic design. I refer to an OECD 2019 report that also refers back to the role of data and the challenges in how we relate to the Indigenous economy itself. In understanding that we can no longer solely measure socioeconomic gap, we need to be able to establish the structures and the concept of being able to measure Indigenous economic impact, to be able to measure Indigenous economic strength, and to correlate that over time. Without the appropriate data, it becomes difficult to situate the visibility of the growth of the Indigenous economy. Being able to facilitate a new narrative of Indigenous economic strength is a key role of economic reconciliation itself. We ask different questions if we see the value of the Indigenous economy at $32 billion. We ask different questions when we see the value of the potential of a $100 billion Indigenous economy. Some of those questions might be, how do we do policy differently? In what way do Indigenous nations identify with the limitations of the Indian Act to support the structures of Indigenous economic growth? Some of the questions that we might ask in driving the potential of a $100 billion Indigenous economy is what tools and resources are required to facilitate economic leverage and economic strength. It's in asking the correct questions, instead of looking at the cost of Indigenous economic programs, to be able to build the business case of a $100 billion Indigenous economy. Everybody has to be able to understand Indigenous economies as needing to be able to function. I raise my hands to the work of the Aboriginal Capital Financial Institutions Network, who have spoken to the capped amount of capital that has been deployed to Indigenous businesses over time, and how that in spite of that, the growth of Indigenous business has seemingly overcome and met the challenge of the underdevelopment and undercapitalization of the Indigenous economy itself. Until the Indigenous economy, the facilitation of capitalization of the Indigenous economy is met as a design challenge to support the tools and to support the visibility of a growth of Indigenous economic strength. That is Indigenomics. To design the construct, the tools, the resources, and the narrative of a $100 billion Indigenous economy. That is Indigenomics.